There is a specific kind of silence that falls over a room when someone asks the wrong question. Not the wrong question in the sense of rude or inappropriate. The wrong question in the sense that it lands somewhere the person being asked didn't expect. It's the kind of silence that reporters feel before they reach for their pen. The kind that lawyers recognize before the other attorney objects. The kind that trained investigators know means something just shifted. That silence fell over a congressional hearing room in Washington, D.C., not because someone shouted, not because someone pounded a table or accused anyone of a crime. It fell because a former military prosecutor, a man who spent years inside courtrooms where lying under oath had consequences, asked a question so precisely constructed that the answer it received told you more than any answer possibly could. Washington is a city built on language, polished language, practiced language, language designed to move past your defenses before you realize it ever touched you. Politicians, directors, officials, they are professionals at speaking at length while saying almost nothing. But every now and then, someone walks into that world who was trained in a different kind of room. Not a hearing room, not a press briefing, an interrogation room. And those two worlds do not speak the same language. Tonight, we are going to walk through what happened in that hearing, line by line, question by question. We are going to examine not just what was said, but what the saying of it revealed. Because in cases like Jeffrey Epstein's, the most important things are almost never spoken out loud. They live in the pauses, in the qualifications, in the careful choice of which word to use when a dozen others were available. And once you learn to hear those things, you can never unhear them. Before we talk about the hearing, we need to talk about the case at the center of it. Jeffrey Epstein, a name that has become something more than a name over the past decade. It has become a symbol of wealth operating above consequence, of power insulating itself from accountability, and of institutions that many Americans believe failed them at the most fundamental level. Epstein was a financier, connected, influential, photographed alongside presidents, royalty, and the kind of people whose names appear at the top of organizational charts that most of us will never see. For years, he moved through the upper echelons of society with what appeared to be total impunity. His island, his planes, his residences in multiple countries, his access to people at the very highest levels of global power. And then, in 2019, he was arrested. The federal charges were serious: sex trafficking of minors, conspiracy, the kind of charges that, if proven, would result in a sentence measured in decades. The public waited for answers. The victims waited for justice. Investigators began building what many described as one of the most consequential cases in modern American legal history. AG officers are not ordinary lawyers. They operate in military legal environments where the stakes of a case can include imprisonment, discharge, loss of career, or in the most extreme circumstances, execution. They prosecute, they defend, they advise commanders. They navigate a legal system designed for environments where the normal rules of civilian court don't always apply. And they interrogate. Military interrogation is a discipline, not the crude, aggressive kind you see in films. The methodical kind, the kind that's built on establishing baselines, normal behavior, normal speech patterns, normal body language, so that deviations from those baselines become visible. In that world, how someone answers is often more revealing than what they answer. A witness who answers quickly and directly on most questions, but suddenly becomes precise and technical on one specific question. That shift is data. A witness who uses active voice throughout an entire testimony but switches to passive voice for a single moment. That switch is data. A witness who answers the question asked every time, until one specific question arrives and the answer begins to reshape itself mid-sentence. That reshaping is data. Ted Lieu spent years collecting that kind of data, in rooms where the person across the table had a very strong motivation to give you as little of it as possible. When he entered Congress, he brought those tools with him, and most people in Washington had no idea what that meant, until he sat down across from an FBI director and started asking questions about Jeffrey Epstein. It is also worth understanding something about the environment that hearing took place in. Congressional hearings are not trials. They are not depositions. There are no objections, no judges, no rules of evidence. What they are is theater, carefully choreographed theater, where both sides know their lines and the purpose of the performance is rarely about uncovering truth. It is about controlling the narrative. Most lawmakers who sit in those chairs operate within that framework without question. They ask questions designed to generate a soundbite. They speak to their base more than they speak to the witness. The witness knows this. The press knows this. The public, increasingly, knows this. And that is exactly why what happened next was so different. Patel did not come to that hearing without preparation. As director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, he sat at the top of the most powerful domestic law enforcement agency in the United States. The FBI investigates federal crimes, counterterrorism threats, foreign intelligence operations, and cases of public corruption. It employs tens of thousands of personnel. It maintains field offices in every major American city and attachés in dozens of countries. Patel had been appointed to that position during one of the most politically contentious periods in the agency's recent history. His name had been attached to controversy before he ever took the director's seat, associated with investigations into investigations, with the kind of Washington recursion that makes ordinary citizens feel like the ground is always shifting. His defenders described him as a reformer, someone willing to shake loose the institutional inertia that had calcified inside the Bureau over decades. His critics described him as something else entirely. But whatever your read on Patel, he was not an amateur. He had served in national security roles at the highest levels of the executive branch. He had written extensively about intelligence operations and the relationship between the security state and political power. He understood how congressional hearings worked. He understood what certain questions were designed to accomplish, and he understood how to navigate them. Witnesses in hearings like this are prepared extensively. Staff counsel reviews anticipated questions. Practice runs are conducted. Answers are refined until they can. Cameras that were tracking every micro-expression in the first hour begin to drift. Reporters who were scribbling furiously start to browse their phones. Lawmakers on the panel who aren't actively questioning lean back in their chairs and check their schedules. It is in those middle hours that the most skilled questioners do their best work, because the witness has settled. The preparation has worn slightly smooth. The guard is maintained, but the sharpness of the first hour has given way to something more automatic. Lieu had been watching, not just the witness, the entire room, the dynamics, the patterns, listening not just to the questions being asked, but to the ones that weren't. When his time came, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't use inflammatory language. He didn't make accusations. He started with a question so procedural, so seemingly administrative, that it would barely have registered as interesting to anyone watching casually. Director, how do important investigative files move through the FBI? That was the opening. Simple, clean, almost boring. But it wasn't boring. It was a foundation. And foundations matter enormously when you're about to build something on top of them. Patel answered the procedural question the way any prepared witness would. Important files come to my desk. It was a reasonable answer. Logical, credible, single sentence. The director of the FBI is involved in important matters. Important files reach him. That is how large organizations are supposed to work. Lieu received the answer, did not react to it visibly, did not write anything down, did not look at his notes. He simply repeated it. Important files come to your desk, not as a challenge, not with emphasis, just as a repetition. This technique has a specific purpose in interrogation. When you repeat someone's statement back to them in a neutral tone, you accomplish several things simultaneously. First, you confirm the statement for the record. The witness has now said it twice, making it harder to walk back later. Second, you force the witness to hear their own words from outside their own mouth, to experience them the way a listener would. Third, you create a moment of stillness in which the witness has to decide whether to maintain the statement or begin to qualify it. Most witnesses, when their statement is repeated back to them in a neutral tone, do one of two things. They confirm it, or they begin to soften it. Patel confirmed it, and that confirmation became a wall that Lieu was about to build a corridor through. Would you consider the Epstein investigation important? The question had no escape route. To say no would be absurd. One of the most high-profile cases in the Bureau's recent history, involving allegations against powerful figures across multiple countries, carried forward after the death of the central subject. To say yes was to lock in a specific logical sequence. Important files come to the desk. The Epstein investigation is important. Therefore, Patel said yes. The room was quieter now. Not dramatically quiet. The hearing was still running. People were still present. But there was a different quality to the attention in the space. The kind of quality that develops when people sense, before they can articulate why, that something real is happening. In interrogation theory, there is a concept called the deviation point. It describes the moment in a line of questioning when a subject's responses change character. Up until that point, answers are flowing in a consistent pattern, similar length, similar structure, similar level of directness. And then, at a specific question, something changes. The answer becomes longer or shorter. The language becomes more technical or more vague. The subject answers a slightly different question than the one that was asked. Or qualifications begin to appear where none appeared before. The deviation point is not evidence of guilt. Let that be stated clearly. It is not proof of concealment, conspiracy, or wrongdoing, but it is a signal that the subject has entered territory they are navigating more carefully. And when a trained interrogator sees a deviation point, they press. Lieu pressed. If the Epstein case is important, and important files come to the director's desk, had the full body of materials from that investigation reached him? And here, the answer shifted, not dramatically, not in a way that most people watching at home would have flagged. But the answer that came back was no longer the clean, confident statement from 3 questions earlier. Summaries, briefings, high-level reviews, the full volume of investigative materials, with all its complexity, all its sources, all its evidence threads, did not necessarily arrive in the same form as those briefings, and there it was, not a contradiction, not a lie, a distinction. But in a case like Epstein, distinctions are where the most important things live, because the difference between a summary and the underlying materials is not a bureaucratic technicality. It is the difference between knowing what someone decided you needed to know and knowing everything. Lieu didn't hammer the point. He noted it, calmly, without visible reaction, and then he moved forward. To understand why this question about full materials versus summaries matters so much in this specific case, you need to understand what investigators believe those files may contain. Jeffrey Epstein did not operate alone. This is not a theory. It is a legal fact established through multiple prosecutions. Ghislaine Maxwell, his longtime companion and alleged co-conspirator, was convicted in 2021 of sex trafficking and related charges. She was sentenced to 20 years in prison, but Maxwell's conviction, significant as it was, answered one question while raising dozens more. Who else knew? Epstein kept meticulous records, flight logs, guest books, contact information, financial transaction records, the kinds of documentation that, in the right hands, could map a network of complicity that might extend into the highest offices in multiple countries. Over the years, documents have been released in civil litigation, partly, selectively, and always with fierce legal battles over what remained sealed. Names have appeared in those documents that sent shockwaves through the public conversation. Names of people who insisted, to varying degrees of credibility, that their association with Epstein was professional, brief, or entirely innocent. The question that has hovered over the case since 2019 is simple. What does the FBI have? What is in those files that has not been released publicly? What exists in the full investigative record? Not the summaries, not the briefings, not the high-level reviews, that might answer, once and for all, the question of who knew what and when. Those files were what Lieu was circling, not because he had access to them, but because the way Patel answered questions about them told a story of its own. There is a language spoken inside powerful institutions that sounds like English but functions like a code. It is not the language of lying. Lying is relatively easy to detect. This is something more sophisticated. It is the language of strategic ambiguity. When an official says a matter is under review, they are not necessarily lying, but they are also choosing to communicate something that sounds like transparency without actually committing to any specific meaning. Under review by whom? On what timeline? Toward what end? Those questions remain entirely unanswered, and the phrase was designed so that they would. When a document is described as preliminary, it implies the possibility of a final version, but it does not commit to one, and it does not specify what changed between the preliminary and final drafts, or whether anything changed at all. When an official says they cannot disclose publicly, the phrase does the same work as a locked door. It signals that something exists on the other side. It simply declines to say what. None of these phrases constitute evidence of wrongdoing. Let that be said clearly and emphatically. Institutions have legitimate reasons for careful language. Active investigations have integrity that can be compromised by premature disclosure. Victims have privacy interests that override public curiosity. Intelligence sources have safety concerns that outweigh transparency demands. These are real constraints. They are not inventions. But here is the uncomfortable truth that sits at the center of this conversation. When an institution speaks in the language of strategic ambiguity in a case where public trust is already fractured, the ambiguity does not reduce suspicion. It amplifies it. Every phrase that could mean something or nothing feeds a very specific kind of doubt. The kind that doesn't require evidence to spread. The kind that grows in the space between what was said and what was asked. And in the Epstein case, that space has been growing for years. At some point in the exchange, Lieu made a pivot. It was subtle enough that if you weren't watching for it, you might have missed it entirely. He stopped asking about documents. He stopped asking about files and briefings and investigative materials. He started asking about patterns. He referenced his background, not to boast, not to establish credentials in the way politicians sometimes do, as a kind of rhetorical armor. He referenced it because it was relevant to what he was about to observe. He described in general terms what evasion looks like in a military interrogation context. Not accusations, patterns, the use of overly technical language in response to a direct question, answering a version of the question that was not calmly, methodically, as if he were a robot. He laid these out calmly, methodically as observations, not as charges, not as proof, as a framework. And then he invited the room to apply that framework to what they had just heard. It was a remarkable move, because it transferred the judgment from Lieu himself to every person watching. He wasn't saying, "I believe you are being evasive." He was saying, "Here are the patterns of evasion I was trained to recognize. You just watched a series of answers. I leave it to you to observe whether any of those patterns were present." In a congressional hearing, that kind of statement carries enormous weight, because it cannot be objected to, because it makes no direct accusation. Near the end of his allotted time, Lieu did something that experienced questioners do when they have accomplished their setup and are ready to close. He asked a binary question, not an open-ended question, not a question with room for nuance or qualification, a question designed to produce one of exactly two possible answers. Will all Epstein-related materials be released to the public one day? Yes or no? It sounds simple. It is not simple, because either answer creates a problem. If the answer is yes, then the follow-up question writes itself. When? What is the timeline? What is the process? Who decides when the public interest in transparency outweighs the concerns that are currently keeping those materials sealed? If the answer is no, then the follow-up question is even more consequential. Why not? What is in those materials that can never be released? Who is protected by their permanent concealment? And in whose interest is it that the public never know? Binary questions are traps in the truest sense, not because they are unfair, but because they force a choice between two positions, each of which requires justification the witness may not want to provide. The answer that came back was neither yes nor no. It was conditional, subject to ongoing legal constraints, dependent on the resolution of related investigations, contingent on a determination of what can be released without compromising sources, methods, or victim privacy. All of those qualifications are real. All of them are legitimate. But in the context of a case where the public has been waiting for transparency for years, a conditional answer to a yes or no question about whether the truth will ever come out says something. It says, we are not ready to commit. And for millions of people who have watched this case unfold across half a decade, not ready to commit sounds a great deal like not ready to be honest. Whether that impression is fair or not is almost beside the point, because trust doesn't operate on fairness, it operates on feeling, and that feeling, in this case, has been badly damaged. It would be easy to watch this exchange and frame it as a political moment, a Democrat grilling a Republican appointee, a lawmaker scoring points, a director defending his agency, the ordinary theater of Washington, dressed up slightly better than usual. That framing is possible. It is also insufficient, because what happened in that room was not primarily about party affiliation. It was about something more fundamental. It was about whether the American public has the right to know what their government knows. The Epstein case is not a single case. It is a test of whether powerful people who allegedly participated in serious crimes will be held accountable, or whether proximity to power provides a protection that the law is supposed to deny everyone equally. Every time a congressional hearing produces conditional answers and strategic ambiguity in response to direct questions about Epstein, the test is failed in the eyes of a significant portion of the public, and that failure has consequences that extend far beyond this specific case. When institutions speak in a language designed to communicate just enough to seem responsive while committing to nothing, they erode something. They erode the basic belief that the systems designed to protect ordinary people actually protect ordinary people. That belief, fragile, imperfect, essential, is what allows a society to function. Without it, you don't have a democracy that's struggling. You have a population that has simply stopped believing the performance. Ted Lieu walked into that room not just as a congressman. He walked in as a representative, in the most literal sense, of every person who has watched the Epstein case unfold and wondered whether the truth will ever actually arrive. He didn't answer that question. No single exchange in a single hearing could. But he asked it in a way that made it impossible to ignore. And sometimes, the asking is all that's left. The hearing we've been discussing did not exist in isolation. It was one moment in a much longer pattern, a pattern of questions asked and answers avoided that stretches back years. In 2019, the non-prosecution agreement that allowed Epstein to avoid federal charges in 2008 was revisited publicly. That agreement, reached under circumstances that multiple investigations described as deeply irregular, had shielded Epstein and, according to legal experts, potentially his co-conspirators, from federal prosecution for more than a decade. The prosecutor who negotiated that agreement, Alexander Acosta, had gone on to become Secretary of Labor in the Trump administration. He resigned when the scope of the original deal became public, but the questions about who knew, who approved, and who benefited from that agreement were never fully answered. In 2021, the Maxwell trial offered some answers. It confirmed the existence of an organized trafficking operation. It confirmed that multiple victims had been abused over multiple years. It resulted in a significant conviction. But Maxwell did not name names. She did not provide a map of the network. She did not, in any public proceeding, identify the powerful people her attorneys had obliquely referenced as knowing participants in what prosecutors described as a criminal enterprise. The documents released through civil litigation have provided fragments, names, dates, locations, descriptions of events that implicate figures who have never faced criminal charges. Each release generated enormous public attention. Each release was followed by statements, denials, and legal responses. Each release answered some questions while leaving others conspicuously open. And the full investigative file, the one Patel was asked about, the one that contains everything the FBI has assembled across years of investigation, remains outside public reach. Somewhere in that file are answers. Whether those answers will ever see light is the question that congressional hearings keep trying and struggling to force. Let's be precise about what we know and what we don't. Because in a case like this, the line between established fact and speculation is one that deserves to be drawn clearly. What we know. Jeffrey Epstein was arrested in 2019 on federal charges of sex trafficking. He died in federal custody 6 weeks later. The official ruling was suicide. That ruling was disputed by independent forensic experts. The circumstances of his death, camera failures, sleeping guards, absence of a cellmate, raised questions that were never definitively answered. Ghislaine Maxwell was convicted in 2021 of sex trafficking and related charges. She is currently serving a 20-year sentence. Multiple civil lawsuits have resulted in settlements. Documents from those suits have been released, partially over time. Those documents contain names of individuals who have not been charged with any crime. The FBI has an active investigative file on the Epstein network. The contents of that file are not publicly available. What we don't know, we do not know the full scope of who was involved in the trafficking operation. We do not know whether additional prosecutions are planned, underway, or foreclosed. We do not know what the full investigative file contains. We do not know why certain individuals who appear in documents have not been charged. We do not know whether the decision not to charge them reflects insufficient evidence, active investigation, or something else entirely. We do not know what really happened in that cell on August 10th, 2019. We do not know if we will ever know. That inventory of unknowns is not a conspiracy theory. It is a description of where the official record ends, and the distance between where the record ends and where public understanding demands it reach is the space in which this entire conversation lives. There's a version of this story that ends with a simple conclusion. A powerful man committed serious crimes. He was caught. He died before he could be tried. His co-conspirator was convicted. The system, imperfect as it is, produced a measure of accountability. The remaining questions are being worked through by investigators and prosecutors who are doing their jobs inside a framework of legal constraints that exist for good reason. That version is not a lie, but it is incomplete, because the Epstein case didn't just reveal what one man did, it revealed the infrastructure around him. It revealed how proximity to money and power operates as a form of protection. It revealed how institutions respond when the people implicated in wrongdoing are the same people those institutions depend on for legitimacy, funding, or survival. And what it reveals the consequential part of the entire story. Because the people who watched that congressional hearing and felt frustration when a simple yes or no question produced a qualified, conditional, technically defensible non-answer, they weren't wrong to feel that. They were responding to something real, the feeling that the institutions built to pursue truth are sometimes more invested in managing it. Ted Lieu walked into that hearing room with tools most legislators don't carry. He used them carefully, precisely, without theatrics. He did not solve the case. He did not produce a confession. He did not unlock the sealed files or compel a different kind of transparency. What he did was demonstrate something. He demonstrated that questions can be asked in a way that forces accountability even when direct answers are withheld. That the way a powerful person answers a question is itself a form of evidence. That silence, qualified carefully in the language of bureaucracy, still sounds like silence. And in a case built on decades of people staying quiet while something terrible happened, the sound of silence is not neutral. It never was. The hearing room has emptied now. The cameras have moved on to other stories. The news cycle has carried the moment downstream into the flow of everything else that competes for attention in a world that produces new outrages faster than old ones can be processed. But the case is still open. The files are still sealed. The full story is still somewhere inside a building in Washington, D.C., locked away in a format that the public cannot read. And somewhere, in offices that don't have their names on the door, people are making decisions about what gets released, when, and in what form. About which answers the public deserves, and which ones it will simply have to live without. What happened in that congressional hearing was not a resolution. It was a reminder that the most important work in a democracy is not done in elections. It is done in rooms like the one we've been discussing, by people willing to ask the precise question, at the right moment, in the right way, with the skill to make an evasive answer feel as loud as a confession. Because in rooms where power protects itself through language, the sharpest weapon available is a question that has nowhere to hide. The Epstein files are still sealed, the full truth is still out there, and the question asked in that hearing room is still waiting.